Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning into this story. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I'd been on the road for about 3 days, riding separate from my crew. We had all planned a cross-country run to mark a close friend's anniversary with the club. After years of traveling together, it was routine for us to split up and meet at a designated spot. Whenever I fell behind, they knew I would catch up. That was sort of my reputation. Unfortunately, fate had other ideas. 2 mornings ago, my bike started sputtering. Some issue with the fuel line or the engine, enough to force me off the main highway and into a small town called Fairbridge. You know those places that have a single main street, a few brick buildings, and just one diner that also doubles as the local coffee spot? That was Fairbridge. When I rolled in, the place seemed normal enough. A few folks going about their day, a handful of cars lining the curb, and the sun climbing over the rooftops. As I stopped to refuel, the station attendant, a wiry man who looked half asleep, casually mentioned that the local radio station was acting strange, broadcasting repeated emergency messages. He shrugged it off with an uneasy laugh, suggesting it was probably a glitch. Then he looked at my bike and pointed to a sign advertising car and bike repairs, Cody's garage. Figuring it couldn't hurt to get a professional opinion, I took his advice. Cody was in his 20s, hair tied back in a ponytail, with grease-stained hands. He gave me a friendly nod before his face fell into a frown as he peered under the bike's panels. After an hour or so, he thought he had it fixed, though he confessed it wasn't a permanent solution. I thanked him, paid, and decided to grab a quick bite at the diner before hitting the open road again. At that point, the only odd thing was a small group of people huddled around a TV in the diner. The volume was turned way up, and the broadcast was flipping between an emergency alert test pattern and news reports. I didn't catch much more than a few phrases like widespread attacks and civil unrest, but I brushed it off as something happening in a faraway city. On the rare occasions that my club and I watched the news, it was usually the same story in a different place. Unrest, conflict, chaos. I had no reason to suspect this time was any different. I should have paid more attention. I left Fairbridge a bit later than planned. Cody's repairs held up fine for a while, but something felt off. It wasn't just the bike. The entire atmosphere of the roads felt different. Traffic had thinned more than usual, and the drivers I did pass looked tense. Some had their windows up, eyes darting at every intersection. Almost every radio station was garbled or broadcasting that emergency signal beep. A sense of dread started building in my stomach. I tried calling my club leader Jack, nicknamed Thunder. No service. Tried again, and the call dropped, as if the towers were overloaded or no longer working. My next calls to 2 other members, Sarah and Ramon, didn't go through either. A chill ran through me. It was unlike them to all have their phones off. With each mile, I became more aware of an eerie tension. I noticed fewer people outside, more locked doors, and many store windows had handwritten signs reading things like, "Closed for security." Even gas stations looked deserted. Occasionally, I saw a stray figure rushing across the street, glancing nervously over their shoulder. Still, the real gravity of what was happening didn't sink in until I stopped at a rest area by the interstate. Usually, these places are crawling with travelers stretching their legs, but it was empty. All the vending machines were unplugged. An abandoned SUV sat near a curb, with all its doors open. My instincts were screaming at me to keep riding, to make it to my club as soon as possible. But I also needed to rest my bike. The patched-up repair job was heating up the engine in ways I didn't like. I parked under a tree for a moment, letting the engine cool. There, I listened to the wind rustling the leaves and something else, something like far-off, frantic shouts. It sounded like a handful of voices, carried by a breeze I couldn't pinpoint. I was tempted to investigate, but any curiosity I had was overwhelmed by a growing need to get back on the road. In my mind, The only mission was to meet up with my club at the rendezvous spot, about a day's ride ahead. That's where we'd planned to regroup. If they were facing the same confusion, they might already be waiting there. So, after letting the bike cool, I swung my leg over the seat and roared out of that place, trying not to think about what might be happening behind me. By dusk, I was miles from the rest area, winding through back roads that cut across farmland. The main highway had been clogged with cars at a standstill, so I took a detour. Initially, the farmland seemed calmer, no traffic, no congestion. But as the sun set, shadows lengthened across the road in unpredictable shapes. The solitude became suffocating, and the corners of my vision played tricks on me. Movements in the fields, flickers of light in empty barns, shapes crossing behind tall fences. I decided to push through. The bike's single headlight guided me along twisting roads, gravel paths, and occasional wooden bridges over slow-moving creeks. In the distance, I could see faint glows like small fires or flickering streetlights. The only other human sign was a battered station wagon, its front smashed against a utility pole. I slowed down to see if anyone needed help. The inside lights were on, revealing an empty driver's seat and a single child's shoe on the passenger side floor. An uneasy feeling gnawed at me. I pressed on. Eventually, the farmland gave way to rolling hills and thick groves of trees. My headlight illuminated old wooden road signs pointing in various directions. That's when I saw another pair of headlights up ahead, not moving. They belonged to a motorcycle lying on its side. Its rider was nowhere in sight. My heart jolted. Could it be someone from my club? The paint job was different from what I'd seen on my friends' bikes, but it was still possible. Parking a short distance away, I removed my helmet and approached cautiously. The engine was cold, and the keys were still in the ignition. There were scuff marks on the asphalt and footprints leading off into the woods. I called out, "Hey, anyone there?" Silence. That's when I noticed a trail of something dark, maybe oil or something else, leading toward the tree line. The branches beyond the road were shaking slightly. I had a flashlight mounted on my handlebar, so I unlatched it and shone it into the trees. My heart hammered louder than my footsteps as I stepped forward. "Hello?" I tried again. A shape darted between the trunks, too fast for me to identify. Then I caught a glimpse of it. A person. No, something that looked almost human, but moved in an unnatural, jerky way. A second figure emerged behind the first, staggering. I remembered the words from the diner broadcast: widespread attacks, violent aggression. My mind reeled. Could this be the same phenomenon? They were about 20 yards away, half obscured by tree trunks. They didn't seem to respond to my calls, just lurched closer. When my flashlight beam flicked across their faces, I saw eyes that looked vacant yet hungry. I felt a surge of dread so intense I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. They kept coming, slow but deliberate. I rushed back to my bike, adrenaline flooding my system. My gloves slipped on the throttle as I started the engine. The next few moments blurred together. My motorcycle roared. The beam of my headlight wobbled across the road, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw more figures in the trees. Then I sped away as fast as I could, ignoring every speed limit sign, heart thudding in my ears. I rode well into the night, not daring to stop again until I absolutely had to. My fuel gauge dipped dangerously low. The roar of my engine was the only thing that kept me tethered to reality in that growing darkness. The road wound up a steep hill, and at the crest, I finally saw the green and white glow of a gas station sign in the distance. Relief and apprehension battled inside me. I needed fuel, but the idea of encountering more of those strange figures made every muscle in my body tense. Pulling into the station, I noticed the lights were still on, and the doors were unlocked. No one stood behind the cash register. I called out, "Anybody here?" Silence. The interior was dim, lit only by flickering fluorescent lights. Row after row of snacks and drinks looked untouched. On the counter, a half-eaten sandwich sat next to an overturned coffee cup. It felt like the people had vanished in the middle of their shift. I grabbed a fuel pump and filled up my bike, keeping my eyes on the dark edges of the lot. The only sounds were the clicks of the pump and the soft hum of overhead lights. Once I finished, I took a deep breath and forced myself inside to see if there was anyone in need of help, or to at least leave some money. I'm not a thief, and I couldn't just take the gas without paying. Carefully, I left some cash on the counter, weighed down by a can of soup I found near the register. That's when I noticed a small portable radio behind the counter. Hoping for information, I fiddled with the dials until static gave way to a shaky voice. It was some kind of local emergency broadcast. Stay indoors. Do not engage. If you have been bitten. We do not have official statements. Please remain calm. My hand trembled on the dial. Bitten? Whatever was happening was bigger and more terrifying than I could have imagined. I stuffed the radio into my jacket pocket, turned off the lights to avoid attracting attention, and hopped back onto my bike. I pulled out of that station, headlights off for the first 50 yards, until I was sure no one was watching. Once I felt it was relatively safe, I turned the beam on, guiding me through the night with a cold, uneasy feeling that spread through my entire body. On quieter stretches of the road, my mind wandered to my club. We called ourselves the Night Wolves, a name we chose more for the poetic ring than any fierce intention. We weren't involved in anything illegal. We just loved the road, the freedom, and the camaraderie. Jack Thunder Grey was our leader, an older rider with a lightning bolt emblem on his jacket. Then there was Sarah, the one who could fix anything that had an engine. Ramon, the group's navigator, always carrying detailed maps of every state we crossed. Where were they now? Were they stuck on the highway, or holed up in some bar, or maybe looking for me? The thought of them facing those strange, staggering figures made my stomach churn. We had a rendezvous spot, a place called Crescent Junction, known for a roadside motel with a big neon sign. That was supposed to be our meeting place after a few days of separate travel. I pressed forward on that winding road, clinging to the hope that they'd all be there, waiting, maybe perplexed but safe. If any of them had encountered the same things I did, they might be on high alert, but they'd be together. And together, we could figure out what to do next. By the time the sun's early rays broke over the horizon, I found myself on a scenic overlook. Exhaustion tugged at me, so I stopped for a moment to rest. The vantage point offered a panoramic view of the valley below, farmland, a few rolling hills, and further on, a smudge of what looked like a bigger town. That's when I truly grasped the scale of the disaster. Tiny columns of smoke dotted the landscape. Helicopters circled low in some areas, but I couldn't tell if they were military or news crews. The roads snaking through the valley were littered with motionless vehicles. There was no rush hour traffic, just stillness punctured by the faint throbbing of helicopter blades. I switched on the portable radio, hoping for an update. The same looping message from the night before played with added urgency. Emergency protocol. Remain inside. Local authorities have set up checkpoints. If you encounter aggressive individuals, do not approach them. Aggressive individuals. That had to be the same type of person I'd seen near the woods, the ones with those blank, hungry stares. A chill sliced through me, sharper than the crisp morning air. I debated my next move. Should I try to find a police station or emergency shelter? That went against every instinct, as I had no guarantee they'd still be staffed or safe, and I'd never been one to rely on official channels anyway. My club was my home, my anchor. I pulled out my phone again, no service. Before I left, I took one last look at the valley. Even though it was a beautiful sunrise, I felt no comfort. The world below and the rest of the world beyond had changed overnight in unimaginable ways. An hour into my ride, I rejoined the main highway, hoping that the path would lead me closer to Crescent Junction. The radio's warnings made me uneasy, but the highway was a direct route, and time was crucial. At first, it was surprisingly empty. No trucks, no cars, just the hum of my engine echoing against the concrete barriers. Then, Around a bend, I encountered a major traffic jam. Cars and trucks were abandoned in every lane. Their doors were flung open, and some windows were smashed. Clothing, suitcases, and personal belongings lay strewn across the road. My heart pounded as I navigated between cars, weaving slowly to avoid debris. Here and there, I saw dark stains on the pavement, indications of an earlier struggle. I tried not to dwell on it. Occasionally, I'd notice movement in the distance, someone peeking from a car window, or a shape darting behind the guardrail. But I saw no large groups, no rescue teams. I rolled to a stop by an RV that had its side door open, dangling by one hinge. Inside, there was scattered luggage and a half-eaten meal on a table. No sign of the owners. A folded map on the dashboard showed a route similar to my own. Every detail hammered home the reality that a mass exodus had happened here, with nowhere safe to go. Suddenly, I heard a metallic clang from somewhere behind the RV. Cutting the bike's engine, I listened intently. Soft shuffling, then a light knock against metal. My skin prickled. I didn't call out this time. I'd learned that some things out here weren't likely to answer in a friendly voice. Instead, I carefully walked around the RV, crouched low. Between two SUVs, a figure was crouched, facing away from me. It was wearing what might have been a uniform or heavy jacket, covered in dust and grime. My breath caught. Was it an officer? A traveler? I couldn't tell. The figure was fumbling with something. Then it turned slightly, revealing a face that looked drained of color, with hollow eyes. My stomach twisted as it bared its teeth, letting out a low, rasping sound. I moved before it could fully turn my way, slipping back to my bike. My heart hammered against my ribs as I quickly restarted the engine. The figure emerged from behind the SUV, arms swaying, head cocked at an unnatural angle, stepping in my direction with that slow, predatory gait. Revving the throttle, I sped around a block of cars, nearly clipping a side mirror. In my mirrors, I saw that figure still shuffling after me, even as I picked up speed. It seemed unstoppable, determined. A wave of panic threatened to paralyze me, but I focused on the road, weaving around the jam until I found a gap in the median. Finally, I broke free from the clog of abandoned vehicles and gunned it onto the open stretch of highway beyond. I had covered several miles when I spotted a lone person on a motorcycle in the distance, riding in the same direction. My heart leapt with a spark of hope. Company, maybe even someone from my club. I accelerated, flashing my headlight. The rider noticed me and slowed, pulling onto the shoulder. I stopped a safe distance behind, not sure what to expect. They lifted their visor. A young man, probably early 20s. He looked just as startled as I was. I raised a hand cautiously, trying to show I meant no harm. "Hey," I said, voice shaking slightly. "Are you all right?" He nodded slowly. I think so. Everything's upside down. I'm trying to find my family." He seemed harmless, just another person caught in this nightmare. We introduced ourselves briefly. His name was Eric. He'd been on the road after the outbreak started, fleeing from a city to find relatives in a smaller town. Along the way, he'd seen things he could hardly describe. People attacking each other, highways blocked off by makeshift barricades. I told him about my bike club and how I was heading to Crescent Junction. He said that was roughly on his route. We agreed to stick together for a while. Safety in numbers. If we encountered a big group of those aggressive individuals, we'd have a better chance side by side. We rode in companionable silence for a few miles, scanning the empty fields and distant farmhouses. Although the tension never left, it felt slightly more bearable with someone else around. We pulled over once at a rest stop. It was vacant except for a stray cat darting between bushes. We each quickly grabbed water and some packaged snacks from an unlocked vending area. Still, we didn't linger long. Places like that felt like traps now. We followed signs leading to a town called Greenfield, hoping to top off our fuel tanks and maybe gather more supplies. Yet as soon as we reached the outskirts, we realized something terrible had happened there. Cars sat wrecked at intersections. A few houses had broken windows. and the main street was littered with tipped-over trash cans and scattered belongings. We slowed, rolling cautiously through the debris. At first, it seemed deserted. Then, behind a small grocery store, we saw movement. A few figures walked aimlessly in the parking lot, their heads lolling. Some had injuries that should have stopped them from walking, yet they kept wandering. Eric shot me a fearful glance. We decided to avoid the grocery store and look for a gas station on the other end of town. The station we found had its doors boarded up. A sign painted on the boards read, "Keep out." However, the pump nozzles were still accessible. We quickly dismounted, scanning our surroundings, and began fueling our bikes. The tension was immense, like we were in the eye of a hurricane. The faint moans of those things echoed from somewhere in the distance. Halfway through filling up, we heard a scraping sound. We turned to see a group of them, 5, maybe 6, shuffling around the corner of the station. Their vacant eyes locked onto us. Eric's face went pale. "Hurry!" I hissed, yanking the nozzle from my bike as fuel dripped onto my boot. They approached faster than I expected, still mostly silent but with a single-minded purpose. We started our engines just as one reached out a hand, nearly grazing Eric's shoulder. He jerked away, and we roared onto the main road, hearts pounding. We didn't stop until we were well out of Greenfield, passing a sign that read, "County Highway 22. The memory of those reaching hands sent chills through my entire body. That was the closest I'd come to direct contact, and I had no desire to see how an encounter would end. As the road stretched on, Eric confided that his relative's place was just a few miles off County Highway 22. He didn't know if they'd made it, but he had to try. I understood. Everyone had their own priorities now. I told him I'd continue to Crescent Junction. We exchanged radio frequencies in case we both found working shortwave sets. Then, with a wave, he turned off onto a side road lined with tall evergreens. Riding alone again felt heavier this time. Even though Eric was a stranger just hours ago, he'd become a companion in this strange new reality. Now, with the quiet hum of my bike returning, the sense of isolation weighed on my shoulders like a physical burden. I pushed forward, fueled by a single thought: find my club. That single-minded focus was all that kept me from panicking, because if I paused too long to consider what had happened to the entire world, I might lose the nerve to keep going. At midday, I pulled over at a scenic viewpoint to rest. I had a bit of leftover food, some water, and that portable radio. I turned it on, hoping for a news update. The voice on the radio was tense. "If you are on the roads, find shelter. The number of infected is growing. Reports indicate that they are drawn to noise and movement. Please do not travel alone if you can avoid it. We have unconfirmed reports of entire towns being overrun." Infected. That word echoed in my mind. So it was some kind of illness, something that twisted people into those relentless creatures. I remembered one of our older club members, Bill, who used to talk about wild conspiracies. He'd say, "One day, the world will turn upside down, and only those strong enough to ride through the chaos will survive." We all used to laugh at Bill's stories. If he were here now, he'd probably say, "Told you so." I stared at my reflection in the bike's mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, heavy from lack of sleep. Was I tough enough to survive this chaos? My club always said I was resilient, but I'd never faced anything like this. Even so, I had to press on. I tucked the radio away and checked the map I'd taken from the gas station. Crescent Junction was maybe another 3 hours away, if the roads were clear. Back on the road, I crossed paths with a lonely diner standing at an intersection. Its big neon sign was dark, the large windows surprisingly unbroken. The place seemed untouched compared to the devastation I'd seen elsewhere. I decided to check if I could find more supplies or information. Parking near the entrance, I noticed there wasn't a single car in the lot. Inside, the smell of stale coffee greeted me. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, and a silent jukebox stood in the corner. The place looked as if it had just opened. Tables were set, condiments in their holders. I ventured behind the counter and found a phone. No dial tone. I glanced into the kitchen. Metal utensils lay scattered, and the back door hung open, letting a draft sweep through. That's when I heard a sharp clatter from somewhere near the storeroom. My heart lurched. I gripped a serving tray, the closest thing at hand, and slowly inched toward the noise. A figure emerged, a person in a cook's uniform, eyes hollow, steps unsteady. They let out a low moan that sent every hair on my neck upright. I backed away, heart pounding. The cook's uniform was stained and one sleeve was torn. The figure advanced, reaching out. I recognized the same vacant stare and unnatural movements. My throat felt tight as I tried to speak. "Stay back," I managed, but there was no response, just a low groan. The figure lunged, forcing me to swing the serving tray defensively. I barely managed to keep a few feet of distance. In a burst of desperation, I sprinted back into the main dining area. The figure followed, stumbling over a toppled chair. I didn't wait to see if it would get up. I dashed outside, jumped onto my bike and sped off, the diner's signs still dark in my mirrors. The incident rattled me more than I cared to admit. I'd seen them before, but this was the first time one had tried to corner me in an enclosed space. My heart pounded in my ears for miles down the highway. Hours of riding later, my eyes picked out a distant set of lights that could only be Crescent Junction's famed neon motel sign. Relief surged through my veins. This was the place where my club was supposed to meet. Every rotation of my tires brought me closer to them, to safety. When I reached the town limits, the main street was quiet. Some windows were boarded up, and I spotted a group of townspeople standing outside a hardware store, talking in hushed voices. They barely seemed to notice me. I continued to the motel, a sprawling single-story structure with a large parking lot. The neon sign flickered, reading Crescent Motel. My heart pounded with anticipation, searching the lot for familiar bikes. At first glance, I didn't see the cluster of motorcycles I was expecting. A wave of worry crashed over me. Were they inside? Did they leave already? I parked near the office, removed my helmet, and approached cautiously. The office door was locked, the vacancy sign still lit behind the glass. I knocked, but no answer. Looking inside, I saw a figure slumped behind the desk. For a moment, I feared the worst, but the figure moved slightly, and I realized it was an older man, possibly asleep. I banged louder, and he jolted up. His face was worn with fear as he approached the door. He opened it a crack, chain still latched. "We're not taking any new guests," he said. "I'm not here to stay. I'm looking for some bikers, night wolves. Have you seen them?" His expression softened a bit. "A group of bikers was here yesterday. They left in a hurry, said they had to keep moving. Something about meeting more of their friends." He paused, studying my face. "They seemed concerned about the things going on. Paid cash and took off." "Did they say where they were going?" "North, up the old logging road," he replied. "Something about meeting at a safe house." My chest felt tight. They were so close, yet already gone. The man shut the door quickly, muttering something about staying safe. Disappointment and relief mingled in my mind. At least they were alive as of yesterday. But now, they were somewhere else, still on the move. Determined, I left Crescent Junction and headed north toward the logging roads. The sky was growing dark again, but my adrenaline kept me alert. Once I turned onto the old logging path, the terrain grew rugged. Tall pines crowded the road, making every curve feel claustrophobic. Fallen branches and loose gravel made riding treacherous, but I refused to slow down. My friends were out there, maybe a few miles ahead, maybe more. The night air was chillier here, and each turn was a new challenge. Occasionally, I saw faint tracks in the dirt. Could be from my club's bikes or from other vehicles. Shadows danced in my headlights, making me paranoid about every shape in the dark. Then, cresting a small rise, I saw the red glow of what looked like a brake light flickering through the trees. My heart soared. It had to be them. I gunned the throttle, only to slam the brakes when a figure stumbled into the road. Again, it was one of the infected, barely visible in the gloom. It looked drawn by my headlight, arms outstretched. I swerved, almost losing control. Behind it, I heard more sounds of movement. My pulse hammered. How many were out here? The forest seemed full of them, hidden until my engine noise and headlight drew them out. I maneuvered around the figure and pushed forward, the red brake light in the distance still guiding me. At times, I thought I spotted more silhouettes among the trees, drifting closer to the road. Anxiety buzzed in my chest, but I pressed on, determined. At last, after a tense ride, I glimpsed a small campfire off an old logging spur, illuminating several people huddled together. My heart raced. Bikers, wearing familiar jackets. I recognized Jack Thunder by his tall frame and the reflective patch on his leather vest. I honked twice, a signal we always used. Their heads whipped around. A moment later, Jack waved me over, relief plain on his face. I parked, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes as I saw Sarah, Ramon, and a few others alive and well. They bombarded me with questions. Where were you? Did you see what's going on out there? Are you okay? I stumbled off my bike, exhausted and overwhelmed. Sarah practically leapt up to hug me. My voice cracked as I tried to speak. I saw it all. The highways, the towns, the infected. Jack gestured for me to sit by the fire. We've been trying to figure out our next move. We stayed at Crescent Motel for a night but decided it wasn't safe. Ramon spread a map on the ground, a lantern illuminating the swirling lines. We know a place further north, a hunting lodge near the mountains. It's off the main roads, easy to defend, and has a well for water. We're thinking it might be a safe spot to wait this out, or at least figure out a plan. I felt a surge of warmth in my chest. We had a plan, and we were together. After the madness I'd witnessed, being reunited with my riding family brought a sense of hope. We spent the rest of that night around the fire, sharing stories of what we'd seen. Some had encountered small bands of survivors. Others had narrowly escaped overrun towns. The sadness of it all weighed on us, but we clung to each other for strength. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the pines, we packed up. My club was battle-worn but unbroken. Engines rumbled to life one by one, echoing through the forest. It was time to move on, to find that hunting lodge and fortify ourselves against this new reality. Before we set off, Jack put a hand on my shoulder. We're together now. Whatever comes next, we face it as a family. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Surviving the first day of an outbreak had been a harrowing journey. But now, I wasn't alone. We had each other. And on the open road, that meant everything. I don't know what we'll find at the lodge, or if we'll survive in the long run. The world seems to have tilted into a dark place, where the living have become threats, and the infected are everywhere. But I do know that we'll keep riding, because on these roads, the roar of our engines and the bond of our club may be the last flicker of freedom left in this new haunted world. If you find yourself alone on these highways, remember my story. Remember that there are others out here who still stand a chance if they stick together. The infected walk among us. But hope rides alongside us as well, if we dare to keep moving forward, to keep our headlights cutting through the darkness. So when you're out there, look for the roar of distant bikes. It might be us. It might be the night wolves. And if you do, flash your lights, honk twice. Let us know you're there. Because in a world gone quiet, the smallest sign of humanity can mean survival. Ride safe, my friend, and never look back too long. Something might be catching up. Thank you for listening. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps this channel alive. Until next time, stay vigilant and remember, curiosity can be quite the companion, and sometimes a curse.